Having a sewing room is a dream come true. I always say it, and it is that I'm very lucky, I'm very fortunate to have this space where I can come in and do my projects and not think about having to pick up after myself to continue with life. If you have to pick up, you are bound to not do anything because it's much more complicated and you need more time. So I'm really lucky, and I really hope that everyone who has a hobby can really have a space in which to make it possible. And in my sewing room there are things that just make sense, some of them from the beginning when I design it, and some of them from after using it. When you start using it, you think, oh, I should do this or I should do that. And I hope you get ideas. And the first one is my cutting table. If you have the room and can afford to get one or make yourself one, just do it because it's ideal. Here's where everything happens. You trace, you cut, you have your patterns, and it's really useful. So I really recommend it. In my case, the cutting table is not against the wall but perpendicular, which gives me more room because I have double the space of drawers, and it divides the whole sewing room into two different areas. The cutting area and the sewing area, in which I have the machine. I may have less room to move around, but it's much better to have it against the wall and have like a dancing room here, because the important thing is to have surface to work on. So in this area, because it's the cutting area, is where I have everything I need for that. All the fabrics, the measuring tapes, the magazines, the paper to trace the patterns, everything by hand. And in this area of the sewing room is where I have all the haberdashery style stuff, all the bobbins and threads and zips and things to add while sewing. The cutting table is one of these foundation decisions, one of these you make at first when you're designing, and then around it you start changing things from one year to the next when you start using stuff and trying to organize yourself around it. And this one I love, this little reading corner I have since last year, I think. It's ideal because you can sit and read something you are making your mind up to with the patterns, you know, instructions. And then of course it makes sense because it's next to the books, the patterns, and it has a little table next to it for your coffee as well. Of course, I have a few measuring tapes and they are always hanging here from Marie Antoinette, my mannequin, but I had an extra one, and at some point I decided to glue it to the cutting table. It's really useful because you just take your fabric, measure, and that's it. There's no fuss around it, and you don't have to put it on the table and measure it there. It's just really quick. So I really recommend it. It's something that's always been done in haberdasheries and fabric shops, and it's ideal. And one thing you really need in your sewing room is a notebook, or maybe even a few. I always have this here right next to me because there's always notes to take, there's always measurements to take note of, and ideas. And if it's a notebook, it's much better than papers because you don't lose them and your ideas stay there. Still on the cutting table, one thing that really makes sense for me is the CD shelf I repurpose as an organizer for this corner against the wall. When I did it, I shared the opinion, and I always think of it, that all the tables that are against the wall tend to clutter themselves on that corner. We always tend to push things. It doesn't matter if it's the kitchen table, a desk, or in this case the cutting table in the sewing room. We always tend to keep things over there and we push them and everything gets so cluttered and messy. So when I did it, I made myself make this promise that nothing will go off the shelf. Of course, the pink cushion and the notebooks don't fit. I always put it up here anyways. But the rest has to stay there, which is ideal because the whole cutting table, it's really clean and empty, which is how it has to be. And I have books, I have magazines and some tools like all the scissors and the pattern weights. The good thing about having them here is that they're right in the middle, so I can access from both sides, which is ideal. So I really recommend it. And one thing I really recommend is to have an extra pair of scissors. Of course, I have my zigzag, my pinking shears, I have my proper fabric scissors, I have the Spanish ones and the embroidery ones, but it's ideal to have an extra pair of scissors for projects that are not with fabric. For example, if you're going to cut some plastic, some leather, or maybe a zipper that is too long, you don't want to mess around with your nice scissors, you want to have an extra pair. These are some that came with a sewing kit. They are not bad scissors at all, but they avoid you using your good scissors for things that are not that good to cut. So that's ideal, and of course you can use these ones to cut paper when you trace your patterns, or you can have a paper scissors as well. One thing that just makes sense is to keep the same things in the same place or contained in the same way. For example, you are going to keep your cottons together, or for example, your scissors. So in here, in this drawer, I have all the ironing and pressing tools with the tailor's cushions, and is where I iron and press because I have a plug nearby. Even though I'm missing walls, I have a plug, so it makes sense because it's next to the sewing machine, so I can easily finish my sewing and come here to press the seams, which is always nice. One thing that just makes sense is to make the most out of your room and out of the space you have. And one thing I don't have is drawers on the side of my desk, of my sewing table. So because it's hollow, not hollow, but because it's empty underneath, I have massive tabs that have all the upholstery materials and all the foams and wadding and all of that, because it takes loads of space and you can't really put it in drawers, so that's ideal for that. Of course, with a little curtain, a modesty curtain, so it looks nice. And of course, because my sewing table hasn't got any drawers, I have all the little things I use for sewing, all the feet, the needles and the bobbins, all there in a makeup organizer I got. Just ideal because the drawers are really narrow and I can see everything clearly. As well as all the things to clean it, all the screwdrivers, the oil and all of that is just there by hand. As well as one of the able sisters, which is always watching me. And one thing I always recommend to have is double the tools. It takes a lot of time and you waste a lot of time when you need the scissors and you have to get up and look for them on the other side of the room. So it's always good to have extra tools next to your sewing table, next to your sewing machine. Things like an extra pair of scissors, a pin cushion and a seam ripper is always useful to have. The pins, you have to put them somewhere while you're sewing, and the scissors are always useful for threads and for little corners you have to cut to keep on sewing, and the seam ripper can be necessary as well. So it's always good to have right next to your sewing machine. Organization is really personal. It depends on how much space you have and how the room you're working in is divided, the furniture you have and how you display things, the amount of sewing you do and the routines you follow while sewing, how much time it takes, and every person has their own little things they like doing and the things that make sense for them. So it's not something universal, it's not something that you have to do this way, but maybe you get ideas from the things that make sense for me. So I hope you've enjoyed it. Tell me what things make sense for you in your sewing room, and don't forget to subscribe if you're not already, and to share it with someone who might like this content. And I leave you here a link all about my sewing room, all the transformation, the organization I've made during the years, the pattern ways, the pin cushions, the shell cushions I made as well. Everything in here, it's in there. So stick around for a while and I'll see you next week. Bye.
Not next week, on Thursday.